Picture this: a single thread, pulled taut between my fingers, trembling just slightly as I guide it through the needle's eye. That's me, Sylvia, at 46, holding on to the fragile strands of a life I've stitched together over decades in this quiet suburban town. I see myself in the mirror sometimes, graying hair swept back into a loose bun, strands escaping like little whispers of time. My hands, rough and worn from years of sewing, tell stories of every hem and seam I've ever crafted. And my eyes, there's a quiet sadness in them, a weight I can't seem to lift no matter how bright I try to smile. I'm married to Brian, a man in his late 40s, sturdy as the oak furniture he builds in our garage. His hands are calloused too, but from sawdust and hard labor, and his demeanor is reserved, almost distant, like he's always working on a puzzle I can't quite solve. We've been together for over 2 decades, and in the beginning, we were wild with dreams. I can still taste the cheap wine we shared at dusty train stations in Europe. Our 20s a blur of backpacking and sleeping in tents under endless starlit skies. We'd laugh until our sides ached, plotting our next adventure with nothing but a crumpled map and a shared sense of wonder. When we came back, we built a house together, our little fortress of stability, every brick a promise. But somewhere along the way, that stability hardened into stagnation. Now, our conversations are clipped, reduced to the bare bones of life. Bills to pay, groceries to buy, a leaky faucet that needs fixing. I don't know when we stopped talking about dreams, or when the silence between us grew so heavy I could feel it pressing against my chest. My escape is my atelier, a small, cozy space above a local shop where the scent of fabric and thread wraps around me like a warm blanket. It's my sanctuary, a place where I sew costumes and custom garments, pouring pieces of myself into every stitch. The walls are lined with bolts of vibrant cloth, and my old sewing machine sits like a trusted friend in the center of it all. Lately, I've been working with a new client, Caleb, a 38-year-old theater director who's become something of a local legend for his charisma. You can't miss him when he walks in. His raspy voice carries every emotion, like he's always performing, even in casual conversation. His gestures are wild, hands slicing through the air as if he's painting his thoughts for you to see, and those intense hazel eyes of his seem to look straight through you, peeling back layers you didn't even know you had. He's been coming by more often these days, commissioning costume designs for the local theater's upcoming production. Our interactions are professional, focused on sketches and measurements, but there's an energy about him that fills the room, a spark I can't quite name. It's late autumn now, the air crisp and biting, with leaves crunching underfoot as I make my way through another day. Most mornings, I wake up to an empty bed, the sheets on Brian's side already cold. By the time the sun creeps over the horizon, he's long gone to the garage, the faint sound of his tools echoing through the walls of our modest 2-story house. I shuffle to the kitchen, pour myself a cup of coffee, and sit alone at the table, staring out the window at the gray sky. The house feels like a museum of what used to be. Creaky hardwood floors that groan with every step. Walls lined with faded photographs of us grinning in front of ancient ruins or windswept cliffs from our travels. There's a dining table in the corner, polished but untouched, a silent witness to the meals we no longer share. I can't help but think about how we've carved out separate worlds under this roof. Brian has his furniture making, disappearing into the scent of sawdust and varnish, while I have my sewing, losing myself in patterns and threads. 2 parallel lives, barely intersecting. Just the other day, I caught a rare moment with him over breakfast. I was nursing my second cup of coffee when he came in from the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. He mentioned a new order for a custom table, his voice flat, like he was reading off a grocery list. I nodded, murmuring something vague, not sure what else to say. He didn't look at me, just stared into his mug, the steam curling up between us like a barrier. I felt a lump rise in my throat, this ache I couldn't name, as I realized how much of strangers we've become. I caught myself remembering a moment from years ago, during a sudden rainstorm in Italy. We were caught without an umbrella, running through cobblestone streets, and he'd thrown his head back and laughed, this deep, unguarded sound that made my heart skip. We were soaked to the bone, but we didn't care. Now the silence in our kitchen feels heavier than that rain ever did. After breakfast, I headed to my atelier, my heart dragging behind me like a shadow. The space always welcomes me, though, with its familiar chaos, spools of thread scattered across the table, pins glinting in the morning light, the hum of my sewing machine waiting to come alive. I was deep into stitching a costume for the local theater, a flowing velvet gown that demanded every ounce of my focus, when the door swung open without warning. Caleb strode in, his sketchbook tucked under his arm, a grin spreading across his face like he owned the place. His energy hit me like a gust of wind, filling the small room as he launched into a passionate rant about the new play he's directing. He paced around, gesturing wildly, his words tumbling over each other in excitement. I couldn't help but notice how he lingered, leaning casually against my work table, his fingers brushing against a scrap of fabric as if testing its texture. My stomach did a little flip, a sensation I hadn't felt in ages, as I watched Caleb's fingers trace the edge of that fabric. Over the next few weeks, his visits became more frequent, each encounter carrying a heavier weight, an unspoken charge that seemed to hum in the air between us. I'd catch myself waiting for the sound of his boots on the stairs, my pulse quickening at the creak of the door. We'd talk about the costumes, of course, poring over designs and fabrics, but there was always something more lurking beneath the surface, something I couldn't quite name but felt in every glance, every accidental brush of his hand against mine. One specific afternoon stands out in my memory, sharp and vivid. It was late in the day, the kind of hour where the world seems to slow down, and the light filtering through the atelier window turned everything golden. Caleb came by with a new set of sketches for the costumes, his energy as electric as ever. But instead of dropping them off and leaving, he pulled up a stool near my work table, sitting so close I could smell the faint scent of coffee on his breath. He started talking about the scenes he writes late at night, his voice dropping to a low, intimate tone, like he was letting me into a secret world. I listened, my hand still on a piece of satin I'd been pinning, but my focus was entirely on him. The shadows cast by the fading light played across his face, highlighting the lines of experience etched there, and I found myself drawn to the raw honesty in his words. He spoke of loss, dreams that slipped through his fingers, an ambition that kept him awake until dawn. It was the kind of vulnerability I hadn't felt from Brian in years, maybe ever. My chest tightened with something I didn't want to admit, a pull toward Caleb that felt both dangerous and inevitable. The tension kept building, day by day, until it reached a breaking point one humid evening. I was working late in the atelier, the air thick with the familiar scent of fabric and thread, mingled with the faint musk of summer lingering outside. The world was quiet, save for the soft hum of crickets through the cracked window, and the occasional creak of the old building settling around me. I was lost in my work, cutting a pattern with steady hands, when I heard the familiar sound of footsteps on the stairs. Caleb appeared in the doorway, fresh from a rehearsal, his shirt slightly unbuttoned, a sheen of sweat on his brow. He didn't say much at first, just stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight as he moved closer. My heart was racing, a wild thing in my chest, as he stopped just inches from me. I could feel the heat radiating from him, could see the intensity in those hazel eyes that seemed to strip me bare. I couldn't take it anymore. The weight of the unspoken, the pull I'd been fighting for weeks. My voice trembled as I set down my scissors and looked at him, asking, "You always talk about others. What do you want?" The question hung in the air, heavy and raw, and for a long, agonizing moment, he just stared at me. Then, in a whisper that felt like a shout in the stillness, he said, "You." That single word shattered something inside me. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, everything I'd been holding back came crashing down. Right there in my atelier, on the very table where I'd cut fabric just hours before, I betrayed Brian. It was chaotic, messy, threads and scissors scattered around us, a piece of lace caught under my elbow as if mocking the careful order I'd always tried to maintain. Caleb's touch was nothing like Brian's cautious familiarity. There was no gentleness, just a raw, unapologetic need that mirrored something deep and buried in me. It was painfully real, stripping away the numbness I'd wrapped myself in for so long. But as soon as it was over, guilt flooded in like a tidal wave, drowning me in the reality of what I'd done. I'd crossed a line, broken a vow, and yet, beneath the shame, there was a strange sense of liberation, as if a wall I'd built around myself for. The days after that night with Caleb feel like I'm walking on a tightrope, every step a gamble, every breath a risk of falling into the abyss of my own making. I can't face him, can't bear the thought of seeing those hazel eyes that saw too much of me, so I dodge his calls, letting the phone ring until it goes silent, a hollow echo in my empty house. I stop going to the atelier as often, making excuses to myself about needing rest or catching up on errands. But really, I'm running from the memory of that table, the scattered threads, the weight of what I did. Guilt is a constant companion now, a shadow that clings to me tighter than my own skin. It's there when I wake up, a bitter taste in my mouth, and it's there when I lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling while Brian sleeps beside me, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. But even as the shame gnaws at me, I can't erase the memory of that intensity, the way it felt to be seen, to be wanted in a way I hadn't been in years. It's a poison and a cure all at once, and I hate myself for still craving it. At home, I try to bury it all under a facade of normalcy, overcompensating in ways that feel so forced I'm sure Brian must notice. I cook elaborate dinners, roasted chicken with rosemary, creamy mashed potatoes, dishes I haven't made in ages, hoping the smell of herbs and butter will mask the stench of my betrayal. I ask him about his work, leaning in with feigned interest as he talks about a new bookshelf design, nodding at all the right moments, even though my mind is 1,000 miles away. Every gesture, every word feels hollow, like I'm playing a role in a play I never auditioned for. There's a moment that sticks with me, sharp and painful, when I'm standing at the sink washing dishes after one of those overdone meals. The water is hot, steam rising in lazy curls, and I'm scrubbing a plate so hard my knuckles turn white. Brian comes up behind me, his presence heavy in the small kitchen, the creak of the floorboards under his weight making my heart jolt. I can feel him there, just inches away, and I brace myself, terrified that if he touches me, he'll somehow sense it. The lingering trace of another man's hands on me. My shoulders tense, and I flinch before he even reaches out, dropping the plate into the sink with a clatter. He steps back, muttering something about getting a glass of water, but I can't shake the feeling that he felt my reaction, that he's starting to piece together the cracks in my carefully constructed mask. Brian's noticing things now, little shifts that I can't hide, no matter how hard I try. One night, we're sitting in the living room, the TV on mute, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I'm curled up on the couch with a book I'm not really reading, the words blurring together as my mind replays that night over and over. He's in his armchair, nursing a beer, the silence between us thicker than ever. Then, out of nowhere, he turns to me, his voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. You don't wake up crying at night anymore. You don't stay silent. There's a mix of curiosity and something darker in his tone, a suspicion that makes my stomach churn. I force a smile, my lips trembling as I mumble something about feeling better, about finally getting some rest. But I can feel his eyes on me, searching, probing for something I'm terrified he'll find. I keep my gaze on the book, pretending to read, but my hands are shaking, the pages rustling under my fingers. He doesn't push, just takes another sip of his beer and turns back to the muted screen, but the air feels heavier now, charged with questions neither of us is ready to ask. Inside, I'm a mess of contradictions, torn between the urge to confess everything and the desperate need to keep this secret buried. There are moments when I imagine spilling it all out to Brian, letting I remember the drive up to the mountains like it was a slow descent into a truth I wasn't ready to face. Brian had suggested the weekend trip a few days prior, his voice quiet but firm, as if he'd been mulling it over for weeks. I agreed, not because I thought it would fix anything, but because I didn't know how to say no. The car ride was suffocating, the silence between us denser than the fog rolling over the winding roads. I stared out the window, watching the world blur past. Jagged cliffs, towering pines, the occasional glimpse of a distant peak piercing the gray sky. My hands fidgeted in my lap, picking at a loose thread on my sweater, while Brian gripped the steering wheel with a focus that felt more like restraint than determination. Neither of us spoke, not about the weather, not about the scenery, not about the invisible wall that had grown taller with every passing mile. It was as if we both knew this trip wasn't about reconnecting. It was about confronting something we'd been avoiding for far too long. When we reached the cabin, the isolation hit me like a physical force. It was a small, weathered place, tucked away in a clearing surrounded by dense forest, the kind of spot where the world feels like it's holding its breath. The porch sagged under its own weight, creaking as we stepped onto it with our bags. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and forgotten winters, and the sparse furniture, a rickety table, a pair of mismatched chairs, a lumpy mattress in the corner, only amplified the sense of desolation. I wandered to the window, peering out at the endless stretch of trees, their branches heavy with the weight of silence. The smell of pine seeped through the cracks in the walls, sharp and clean, but it couldn't mask the staleness between us. It was like the cabin itself was a mirror, reflecting the emptiness we'd carried with us, the distance that had become our constant companion. That first night, we sat down for dinner at the small table, a simple meal of canned soup and stale bread we'd brought along. The clink of our spoons against the bowls was the only sound for a while, each bite a forced ritual in the dim light of a single bulb overhead. I kept my eyes on my food, afraid to meet his gaze, afraid of what I might see there. Then, without warning, Brian set down his fork with a deliberate clatter, the noise jarring in the stillness. I looked up, startled, and found him staring at me. His eyes steady, but filled with a pain so raw it stole my breath. His voice, when he spoke, was calm. Almost too calm, like he'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his head. I don't know what's changed, Sylvia, but I know it's not just time. I think we need to live apart for a while. The words landed like a punch, sharp and precise, cutting deeper than any argument or accusation ever could. There was no blame in his tone, no anger, just a quiet resignation that made it hurt even more. It was an acknowledgement of our failure, laid bare between us, and I felt the ground shift beneath me, as if the cabin itself might crumble under the weight of his honesty. I sat there, frozen, my spoon still in my hand, the soup growing cold in front of me. My mind raced, searching for something to say, some way to push back against the finality of what he'd just proposed. But nothing came. The truth of his words was undeniable, a mirror to the emptiness I'd felt for so long, even if I couldn't bring myself to voice it. I didn't confess about Caleb. Couldn't confess, not then, not ever maybe. But I didn't deny the change either. I felt my throat tighten, a sob building somewhere deep inside. And before I could stop it, tears were streaming down my face, hot and silent. I nodded, just once, unable to form words, my vision blurring as I stared at the grain of the wooden table. Brian reached across, his hand finding mine, and for a fleeting moment, I felt the warmth of the man I'd "here I am," months after that night in the mountains, settling into a new rhythm in a tiny apartment on the edge of town. It's a small space, barely big enough for a bed, a table, and my sewing supplies. But it's mine. The walls are a faded beige, scuffed in places from past tenants, and the single window looks out onto a narrow alley where stray cats sometimes wander. At first, the quiet felt suffocating, the absence of Brian's steady presence a void I didn't know how to fill. I'd lie awake at night, listening to the distant hum of traffic, feeling the weight of being truly alone for the first time in decades. But slowly, that loneliness morphed into something else: liberation. There's a strange freedom in waking up to no expectations, no unspoken tensions hanging in the air. I can leave a coffee mug on the counter without a second thought, play music late into the night without worrying about disturbing anyone, and let my thoughts wander without the fear of being questioned. This little apartment, cramped as it is, has become a canvas for a version of myself I'm only just beginning to understand. My days have taken on a new shape, one I've carved out with intention. I still work at the atelier most mornings, the familiar scent of fabric and the hum of my sewing machine grounding me like an old friend. I've taken on more theater projects, diving deeper into the world of costumes, letting the creativity spill out of me in ways I hadn't allowed in years. Each stitch feels like a small act of defiance, a way to reclaim pieces of myself I'd buried under routine and silence. Beyond that, I've started joining a local art class on Wednesday evenings, something I never thought I'd do. I'm no painter, not by a long shot. But there's something healing in smearing colors across a canvas, in letting my hands create without the pressure of perfection. It's like I'm reconnecting with a younger Sylvia, the one who dreamed big under starlit skies, who wasn't afraid to feel everything. I sit there among strangers, all of us fumbling with brushes and laughing at our mistakes, and I feel a flicker of joy I'd forgotten was possible. Reflecting on everything, I can't help but think about Caleb's role in all this. He's no longer in my life, not as a lover or even a client. I made sure of that after everything unraveled, but I can't deny the impact he had. He was a storm, crashing through the walls I'd built around myself, walls I didn't even realize were there until they crumbled. For years, I'd lived in silence, swallowing my dissatisfaction, letting it fester in the quiet corners of my marriage. Caleb forced me to confront that, to look at the parts of myself I'd ignored for too long. What happened between us wasn't right, and the guilt still lingers like a faint scar. But I don't regret it. Not because it was moral or fair, but because it woke me up. It shook me out of a numbness I'd accepted as normal, made me see that I deserved more than a life half lived. I had to lose something to find myself, and though the cost was steep, I'm learning to carry it with a kind of bittersweet acceptance. A few weeks ago, I had one last meeting with Brian, a necessary step to tie up the loose ends of our shared past. We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop downtown, a neutral ground neither of us had any attachment to. I got there early, my nerves jangling like loose change in my pocket, and ordered a black coffee to steady myself. When he walked in, I almost didn't recognize him at first. He looked lighter somehow, the tension that used to sit in his shoulders gone, his face softer, almost at peace. He wore a simple flannel shirt, the kind he always favored, but there was a quiet confidence in his step that I hadn't seen in years. We sat across from each other, a stack of paperwork between us, the final pieces of our separation waiting to be signed. The conversation was practical at first, all business, dividing assets, sorting out the last of our shared responsibilities. But then our eyes met, and in that moment of silent understanding, we both knew that despite everything, we would always cherish the years we spent together. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment if you enjoyed this story. This will help us create more engaging stories for you.